好，各位同学大家好，欢迎来到教育研究专论。然后我们今天来看到第4章质性典范的研究取径。第一个主题，质性研究的方法论概说。那么首先来看一下我们提供给大家的阅读教材里面，第一个部分我们要讲到的是质性研究在教育上的发展。其实我们来看一下那个质性研究相对的量化研究嘛。那什么是量化研究？根据黄义之老师的观点来讲的话，量化研究基本上受到自然科学方法的影响，在收集资料进行研究之前，研究者往往必须先做文献探讨，根据先前的理论基础，然后研究发现提出你的研究假设，这样站在前人先榜里面，然后去发展出一些构念，这样，或是如果欠缺相关资料以供参考的时候，可以根据个人的经验里面去提出假设，也是发展出构念或是变相那些观点。接下来跟着那种假设去收集资料，进行资料那个量化资料的分析，然后再去用统计考验的方式去验证假设这样子。如果这个假设得到了资料的支持的话，然后假设与提出假设的理论基础就不是空想而已，等于说有证据可以证明说我们那个理论而来的，或是我们构念的那些假设，或是那些关系是成立的，这样子有证据可以支持，那就比较有高的说服力。如果假设得不到支持的话，就必须修正，然后乃至于说推翻那个假设或是理论。那基本上量化研究方法的流程，建立研究架构、资料收集，包含实验法、问卷调查法、观察法、档案文件法这样。不过广泛来讲的话，我们执行研究有时候也会用到观察法、档案文件法、问卷调查之类的，只是它不会用实验这样。基本上量化研究，它在资料分析与结论的地方、讨论的地方，也会运用到描述统计跟推论统计，然后相关与因果关系的研判，然后实验控制与统计控制等等之类方法的运用。那相对那个量化研究强调那个验证、证实、实证的话，那质性研究历史发展，如果以 Denning 跟 Lincoln 这两个是那个质性研究知名的大师，他们有写了很多质性研究的 handbook， 然后收集了很多质性研究的一些重要的文章的。那区分出来说，质性研究历史发展可以分成传统时期，1900年到1950年，我们看到是那个世界大战之前到第一次世界大战之前到第二次世界大战后，主要是比较偏向于田野文化的调查，民族志学家、人类学家那种田野乡野调查这种。那第二个时期，他认为说现代主义时期是1950年代到1970年代，它就有实证主义的色彩、扎根理论、说明方法论跟剧场理论，主要会运用一些工具或是一些那种工具表等等之类的，还有一些简单的那种归纳的方法、科学探究方法里面去进行那种资料的探究，这样针对一个群体进行探究这样子啊。里面讲到实证主义色彩是说，它里面的那些质性资料的取得还是比较强调证据的地方，比较少那种可以允许自由去那种可以去那种诠释的地方，可能一分证据说一分话这样。那基本上到第三个时期，领域模糊时期是1970年代到1986年代，基本上是多元理论跟方法的策略的一个竞争时期。如果我们看过课程理论研究，你会知道1960年代末期跟70年代是那个多元文化主义的兴起，那一起大家开始那种质疑说那种绩效责任的控制啊，还有那种反战运动、西亚运动这种，带来多少新人文主义的兴起里面带来很多那种对实证的那种既定死板板那种僵化冷冰冰资料那种的抗拒，比较强调开始重视人的重要性这样子。然后第四个时期是在线的危机时期，是1986年到现在，那里面主要处理问题反身性跟后设危机。反身性就是说里面涉及到说我今天去研究一个场域好了，那我自己算不算这个场域中一份子，还是只是一个旁观者？如果反身性的话，就讲说我们在研究过程之中，其实连我自己也是被我自己所研究这样子。反身性，我所研究的东西会回过头来，因为我自己也是被自己研究，它等于说我对这个场域的掌握是我自己身在其中，那我是整体性掌握这个东西，就会回过头来反身性的影响到我自己的那种认知跟成长，甚至我的那种生命的意义这样子。另外一种后设那种危机这样。然后第五个时期，我们看到这后面两个是并行的1990里面兴起后现代时期，重视多元的情境脉络，那重视研究者参与，还有一种 行动研究的那种参与者研究，就是可能会涉及到说他不再是旁观，也不是把自己当做研究对象人，他试图去做一些行为，去改变实务上出现的问题这样子。那基本上按照说德生老师的看法里面，质性研究方法资料收集里面包含说参与观察，又包含说描述性的、焦点性的、选择性的，那以及说深度访谈，包含说非正式的访谈，就也许说下课聊天一下，然后街头去跟人家聊天，取得资料这样，无结构的访谈，里面没有按照规矩，没有按照一题一题这样去访谈，半结构有大致方向的题目，结构式的访谈有预先设计好的题目，按照那个题目去访谈，然后都不能够改变这样。第三种方式资料记录，包含田野笔记，我到田野里面观察，这个情形，这个哪里卖的东西比较贵等等之类的。还有田野行程日记，我今天走过哪里，然后发现哪里有哪些这条路径里面发生什么事情。田野日记，我描述说我这个田野里面看到一群候鸟飞过去啊等等之类的那种情形，我看到那种神明出巡啊之类的。还有理论的备忘录这种，我们在现场到踏入个场域里面去做资料记录、取得资料的这种方式，这样等于说我们刚刚讲到那个质性研究有运用到观察跟访谈，不过它跟量化的观察访谈不同，它观察里面会刚刚讲以身为度嘛，把自己也当是研究对象，强调自己在摄入场域之中的那种观察体悟这样子。第二个是深度访谈里面会讲到说，访谈不是根据那种问卷的问题而已，大家去勾选而已，他会去也许会深入的去追问说背后的意义或者大家看法背后一些理由，或是说可以去推估诠释这种东西，然后透过互相对话去挖出更深层的一些想法。那另外他有做田野笔记，而不是只是数据的 coding 记录而已。因为我个人的想法里面会包含了观察跟我访谈问到的资料，我眼睛看到的，耳朵听到资料里面，或我身体感受到资料里面，我把它记录下来这样。那在资料分析的方法地方里面，就是不是用统计方法的那种那个什么那种考验啊、假设之类的，但是他还会强调编码，在你收集到很多组织稿的资料里面，怎么去每一段去抠出它的意义来，把相同意义里面放在一起，然后组成主题这样。然后包含说开放性的编码、自由的编码、轴心的编码，编码里面还有根据到一些我那种研究的一个既定的焦点主题去编码这样。有一点类似预设这个轴心里面符合这个主轴的，我们就可以把它编在一起这样。还有选择性的编码，选择着重哪些面向编码。另外第二个资料分析也是可以撰写我们备忘录进行反思，然后整合分析结果建立理论。最后一个是撰写研究报告、制度脉络讨论中的那些撰写。那么介绍一下那个在早期的一些影响质性研究兴起的人物。第一个是玛格丽特米的1901年到1978年，在那个看起来像清朝快末年的时候，民国初年的时候，那种到那个20世纪世界大战之后，然后甚至我们刚刚讲1970年代多元文化主义兴起之后，他知名代表是他有去研究原始部落，踏入到因为他们那个欧洲会那个老外他们就那时候早期一次世界大战二次世界大战之前很多海外殖民地啊，然后他进入到很多那种那个第三世界国家里面原始部落里面去调查族群的性别跟气质这样。那另外他也跑到萨摩亚岛里面去探讨萨摩亚成年背后隐含的一些文化跟一些制度习俗的一些问题。他值得注意的是他发现到萨摩亚里面那个性别认同并不是纯粹男性女性而已，也带来一种性别议题文化决定论的那种的探究。他发现到说那个从萨摩亚成年研究里面发现到青少年青春期的青春困扰里面不见得是生理的，而是受到那种族群文化的影响，这样，这带来一个这种基本上田野里面有时候不是针对个别差异，会针对说某个准曲里面一些制度啊、规范啊、习俗啊、文化的那些影响里面。基本上研究场域里面，除了萨摩亚以外，还有新几内亚。他认为说文化会去决定发现它的成果，多年结果会决定民族的气质跟行为。然后个人生活在某个文化之中，人格特质及行为表现都会凸显出来这样。那据说他也是为了深入当地多年，他还跟当地的酋长去结婚，这样以了解那个当地一些重要的习俗跟概念这样。那第二个我们要提到说更早期一个是那个 Bronislaw马林诺维斯基 1884年到1942年，完全是那个世界大战之前的人物。那基本上是那个英国的学者库拉，他主要是有在那个到新几内岛那个研究库拉特罗布里航群岛研究。基本上采取观点是从结构功能论来探究文化背后隐藏的那种制度习俗里面的结构的一些原理原则这样。但我们看到也不难想象啊，在美国早期1900到1930年代里面是结构功能论里面盛行的年代嘛，甚至在1950、60还是结构功能论找出一个秩序跟规则，就所观察到的现象，它也是一样就所观察到这个民族新几内亚民族里面去看到他们文化背后隐藏的一些法律啊、规则啊、这个制度啊的习俗这样。比较不同的是，他透过参与观察，而不是问卷那种调查收集资料而已。他认为说，透过本土的角度、在地的角度啊，亲身踏到田野，人类学家必须每天跟他们那种县民进行联系啊，所要研究的对象进行联系，才能够充分的记录跟理解不同文化非常重要。日常生活之中也隐含了结构制度不平衡的一些要素，这样。有些那个相关的讯息，有兴趣的同学可以去看一下。那这个是马里诺维斯基，好，他跟那种新几内亚那种原住民，在这个部落里面待很久所探讨的一些内容这样。那么接下来看到说，那接下来1950到70年代，主要是在教室里的民族志研究兴起了。Henry 在1963年里面研究教室里面如何鼓励学生晋升的那种教学实施，也是有点类似像我们讲到说那种，我发现到教室当做一个田野调查场域里面，发现到老师运用哪些策略去鼓动学生通过彼此竞争去追求那种成绩的进步这样。那样学者 Geoffrey 1968年，它里面主要是探究内层学校教室里面的复杂性。基本上内层学校是属于那种国外跟我们不一样，国外里面很多城市里面中心，如果住在中心的不见是有钱人，有些人可能会住在那种郊区的豪宅这样子。如果是住在都会中心里面，有时候在内层里面，相对也是一个比较贫穷、那个贫民窟之类的那种学校这样。主要也许他透过这个观念，就刚好我们刚1960年代后期那种反战文化、嘻哈文化跟那种黑人运动啊之类的青少年流行文化的兴起里面，开始去探讨这种弱势族群里面在教室里面那种行为啊、表现啊，或者说一些跟老师之间权力关系的互动这样。另外一个是 Jackson 教室里的生活，那个跟我们教育比较有关。他发现到说，学生在日复一日在教室里面学习到不是课本内容的知识而已，还学习到一种潜移默化的常规，包含说如何举手、如何排队、如何当乖宝宝、如何与同侪竞争、如何争取老师的注意、争取老师的那种青睐。或者老师跟学生里面怎么互动，老师怎么产生认同啊，或者是说表面支持你的支持老师的学生，不见得是成绩好的学生，有时候那种在打瞌睡的，那在票选说哪个老师对我影响最深刻，反而是成绩不好的学生。另外还发现到一个特点是说那个有时候神情灌注看着老师，那一直抄笔记的学生，不见得他的学习成果比那种这样子随便坐着偶尔听一下，老师讲到关键点，竖起耳朵来听一下的学生，成绩表现更那个两者之间不是说那种好像有用功的成绩会比较好，然后面那种成绩就比较散漫的成绩比较差，因为发现到说有时候那种里面教室里面不是那么复杂的，如果他只在抄笔记没有自己的思维的话，可能也许他在平常在那种轻松慵懒的姿态，甚至滑手机，然后听到关键字catch到那种重点的话，也许里面他反而是会学习到精华的地方。所以这里面它也是一个跟我们课程有关的，是带来一个关于潜在课程的思考这样。那我们看1970年代、1980年代初期，主要是客观后实证主义里面，还是强调证据，不过在证据里面开始有一些不同诠释意涵的观点这样子。by Stenhouse 的社会学跟行动研究，透过参与观察去做教师的评鉴。等于这里面的取得的证据啊，不是说那个纯粹是那种僵化的，而且开始有那种不是一个标准普世规约，而一种不同观点、不同情形的那种探究这样。然后另外是许多社会学家威利斯、Desmond、Wagner、Henry Spender 开始从事很多质性教育研究。他们是融入教育社会学里面开展出新教育社会学跟潜在课程，尤其是威利斯里面，他做一个研究是英国一些学校里面发现到劳工阶级比较多劳工阶级存在的私立学校，发现到说传统们认为说接受教育里面可能会被文化霸权啊那种国家意识形态的课程所宰制，这样那带来阶级的宰制。他发现到学生不见得会听老师的。像那个劳工阶级的学生的男生可能会一种那个猎图组里面可能标新立异啊，抽烟啊，喝酒啊，然后把妹啊，载妹出去玩啊，那种秀刺青啊，muscle 的文化这样子。但等于说他发现到学生有抗拒老师的那种功能，在我们讲放牛班的孩子里面，也许他没有听老师讲里面，但也许就那个并不会被洗脑意识形态洗脑。不过另外一个这个问题是在说。他们是因为认为说反正我读再多的书出去也是跟我爸爸妈妈一样做劳工，干嘛读那么多？将来就是当一个劳工就好啦。所以他们崇尚当劳工很优越啊等等之类的。那无形中也复制到再来一种再制自我音乐预言，未来是一代一代都变成劳工这种情形。那威利斯透过实际的田野资料、长期的观察，就透过10所个案里面去发现，那里面如何去影响那个学生表现出来的行为跟那种思考想法这样。他也透过深入场域里面去观察学生行为跟访谈他们的看法，这样。你看 Erickson 跟 Schultz 1977年，他在教育上应用里面也踏入学校场域里面去看那个视讯设备、影音设备怎么应用在教室观察，运用到影音记录这样。然后 Gazen 这边探讨教师论述分析，在教室里面老师说什么话，然后学生说什么话，那背后里面为什么老师会这么讲，学生会怎么讲？他这样子讲背后什么理由，然后是什么，为什么，如何讲，然后产生什么效果，这种会好互坏或者这种观点的那种分析这样。那基本上1980年代、90年代里面开始会踏入一个方法论的建构。如果你对照课程理论的话，我们看到课程理论1980年代是那个在概念化运动里面的那种第二波的兴起的地方，风起云涌的时代里面，开始在 AI 里面崭露头角。你看到那个什么1978年附近那个拍奶被邀请去做那种课程理论化的那种专题演讲，然后走向一个再概念化学派，强调诠释的意义嘛。有别于说以前那种理性实证的意义，或者说技术导向的意义，走向一个概念，那个概念重建、再概念化那种课程理论化意义。那我们看到这个时期里面，果然 AI 也请米德来做一个质性的演讲，探讨教育民族志的讲座也开始被兴起，带来很多质性研究探讨。那其实跟我们课程理论研究发展一样嘛，那这个时期里面走向一个质性的思辨性的研究这样。你看 Borden、Lincoln、Cuba， 我们刚才讲前面这样。还有那个这两个是做叙事探究了，还有这个宣手、Lecamped、Erickson， 他们也开始是发展诠释性的质性研究，不再全部都是强调说那种取得证据起下面做解释的那种客观后实证，尽管可以解释出很多那个在结构后面的一些意义里面，他们会强调说主观的诠释也是重要的。那后期里面实证者研究跟行动研究开始兴起，那研究主题也是不再是外人去研究一个场域里面发生什么事情，而是研究主题，加上老师他自己怎么研究他自己场域的问题，他怎么发现现场问题，然后提出假设去解决问题这样子。另外他们研究主题也另外一个会探讨说老师怎么去叙说出他教室里面观察到哪些事情是他印象深刻的，有哪些他跟他的理念违和，他跟学生的互动情形，他课后的反思违和，还有他那种一路走来那个教学的一些理念啊，是不是受到他成长经验啊，跟校外专业成长之类交互的影响？学生回馈他的行为里面又带来哪些他那种反思后的那种意义成长跟改变那种的可能性？这也是这个时期里面会去探究的地方。这样，那1990年代批判民族志的兴起里面，开始重视到一些那个显性课程的关注，然后批判性去研究教材里面的问题，这样。那研究对象扩充到教师、行政人员、父母，研究重点开始影响到研究者凝视那个觉知于权力运作情形上，不是只是描述表面的现象，而就会看到说背后那种权力如何那种权力机制怎么影响在当局者那个人民的那些想法 跟做法，或者小圈圈团体里面形成一个意涵。在这个时期里面，研究者作为局内人，以前都是我们客观在外面看嘛，研究是别人，而现在我们当你踏入研究场域里面，也是其中一份子，开始思考到这种局内人、局外人的一些角色的关系。所以说，研究者做一个局内人的角色的行动研究也开始出现了，以自己课堂中的问题，然后做一个出发点，更为盛行这样。然后另外批判理论或现代理论也提倡说我们对他者的研究。他者意思就是说，我对我自己的理解不是纯然我自己一个人就好了，有时候我们透过别人对我的想法的回馈，透过他人的理解，交互作用，我跟人家交谈，回过头来影响到我这个人的那种想法跟意义的生成。他者就 others 啊，那个是我们生存在世界里面，我对自己的想法不是自我形成的，是有那种我的建构过程是用他者跟我自我之间的交互作用所建构出来的这样子。所以说后现代一些理论会强调一个词叫他者性，重视他者性的想法，不要一厢独断的那种想法，可能透过人家互动跟对话，不同观点之间的诠释、比较、思辨，来带来超越既有的自身。里面主要是带来一个超越既有的自身，然后透过他者性去概括我们更多那种视野交融或者视野。另外，它也提示我们要必须同时关注显性课程跟潜在课程的重要性这样。那其实他那个什么林肯、Cuba 这些新研究学者，Denning 这些学者里面都认为说，基本上可以分成7个质性研究的主流不同典范。第一个是实在主义的民族志个案研究，强调真实的场域里面的探究。第二个是批判民族志，在研究一个田野里面的一个族群里面，但是它背后里面有那种去做批判反思的那种动作。第三，合作性的行动研究，不是我根据有自己的问题去做解答，我会跟人家合作去进行问题的探索。那第四个是，第三问题有点像 House 里面专家跟在职老师里面去研究校本课程发展的情形，然后专家做一个咨商者，要跟老师作为实践者的合作可能。第四种是局内人在地研究，我踏入那个场域之中，去进行在地那种探索这样子。或者说那个原本我是自己那个在自己家乡的局内人，在地人针对自己的这个在地环境去做探究。第五个是那个自传民族志，里面结合了说民族志里面强调田野调查嘛，然后族群部落探索，但主体里面又探讨到个人的那种传记研究那种的意义存在这样子。等于说里面重视群体的制度文化，又重视个人的声音跟故事两个之间交织出来。然后第二个是表现民族志，怎么把民族志的观点去透过不同方式去背后那种如何表现出来那个权力关系运作一些的方式上形式上。那第这个后现代思潮文学取向艺术本位的那种运用文学批评或是说艺术形式去表现出来那种的探究的手法，比如说我根据我研究对象写一首歌、跳一支舞，然后写一首诗去做一个研究的成果这样子。基本上质性研究有5个基础，第一个是社会科学中的学科观点，第二个涉及到参与观察的田野工作，第三个在田野观察中观察人们，甚至连自己也是被观察的对象，第四个常会用修辞华丽跟质性研究报告。等于说你在写那个质性探究里面，叙事性要很强，故事性要很强，把你所研究的场域的那种发现栩栩如生的，让读者可以栩栩如生，有想象画面的可以去理解这样。所以说第5个问题，研究报告里面要考量到面对的观众，怎么吸引观众的阅读这样。不过质性研究遇到一个问题啊，真实跟虚构之间，那会不会带来科学研究规则的一些的那个冲突这样？Adler 他探讨说，那实在诠释性的民族志跟后现代取向的民族志的不同，一开始比较强调说有几分证据说几分话，根据事实表面的事实来做描述，后现代取向里面会多出一种可以虚构多元那种模拟仿真那种东西，即使不是真的事件，我觉得说有意义。我讲一个，今天跟你说一个故事哦，我以前怎么样，那实际上没有发生，尤其在自传里面，这边人家被质疑说，那种虚构研究里面就不是科学的方法运用啊，就不真实啊，是假的啊。科学都讲到眼见为凭嘛，有事实 有证据有几分证据说几分话，那虚构有没有意义？不过后期有一些学者开始认为说虚构是有意义。如果你所虚构出来那种故事情节，能够带来社会的影响，带来转化效度跟催化效度，你的背后那种意义，这样可以超越自我的现实，带来一些改革的成果，这样。不过太过虚构，你要小心啊，会不会流入一个自恋的那种说法？哦，自己都是好的、啊，这别人陷害我，我自己如何刻苦克难，到最后努力奋发向上，可能像鲑鱼逆流而上，最后成为一个伟人这样，或是这种可能有时候会迷失于自己，或者说自己做过的不好的事情不敢描述出来，或是把它扭曲，基于防卫基准那种东西。那这种东西如果不真实的话，那会不会说，即使有启发人家的想法，里面还是有一个那个没有真实，里面就让人觉得这不是科学的东西这样。另外就是说，历史会不会重演？后实验主义取向如何确保历史的正确性？历史总非都是结合在一起的，很多都是根据我们的那种诠释去补充。但诠释有主观的那种诠释，我们刻意选择 A 或选择 B 段落的材料，或者我们聚焦于 A 段落里面，偏向哪个人的讲法啊，有利于另外一个人的想法，我们就不提这样子，也许或是不小心忽略啊，这样子会不会带来一种研究不客观这样子？然后另外他们学者认为说，质性研究的下一步 ，Erickson 认为说，我们如何克服认知论上的多元论，多元收集资料的方式，这样会不会带来一些，若典范上认识论上的冲突的话，到底要实在的资料，还是我那种想象出来虚构也可以？或者说，我自己用问卷调查的，还是说我通过深入访谈的比较好？这种不同方式取得那种知识的方法、探究的方法里面，如何去调和，如何去那种对话，也许未来挑战的面向这样。好，接下来我们看到质性研究的典范，基本上科学研究的典范是他们是困提出来的，有人叫派点，有人叫范式啊 paradigm。那主要是意思能够代表某一个社群共同信仰、价值、技术构成整体，能为这个整体一部分提供问题解答或作为科学研究的基础。而学者要加入一个社群研究的时候，必须要从典范开始，遵守这个社群成员里面都用什么方法做探究。论文第1章、第2章、第3章、第4章都写什么东西，都有一个固定的那种潜规则或规则存在这样。那 APA 格式也是一个典范啊，美国教育心理学会的典范。这样一来才能够让常态可选能够发生跟延续的先决条件这样。基本上我们讲到说这个典范背后可能涉及一下本体论认识的观点，我们套路讲一下哲学论体的3大范畴。哲学基本上主要的那种常见的会发表形上学、认识论、价值论。形上学是处理那种事件万物背后的那种最终的基础、最开始的基础这样，终极的基础啦。宇宙论主要是讲到说，那我们世界怎么起源啊？我们生活世界的背景是如何啊？整个宇宙是如何去发展演进的？这样，等于说我们生存世界里面背景了。本体论是宇宙中的那种人事物。那种人物啊，这种我身为一个人，或者这里身为一个椅子，这是一只动物，那种背后我为什么是一个人这种。那后期如果讲到人物叫纯有论，椅子如果是一个椅子，椅子有哪些特质里面，这种形上学的那种思考这样子，背后的假定啊，等于说背后的假定啊，有点像是说宇宙论我们打电玩具里面可能是某个什么大陆里面啊，某个世界某个星球里面的故事的背景。本体论也许会探讨说，今天某个东西，也许某个角色战士，某个角色属于战士里面他的那个特质，就是说，可能要去当坦克啊，去抵挡别人的攻击嘛，或者当武力的输出啊，或是魔法师可能是在背后释放魔法，或是弓箭手去狙杀对方的成员，里面有不同的那种既定预设的那种人物的特质，或者说预设事物的特质，比如说椅子就是要被人家坐的，然后木头有哪些木头的材质特性这样。第二个是知识论，知识论有时候会翻译过叫认识论、知识论，但里面还是有不同。认识是属于说我们透过什么方式途径去发现宇宙的真理，知识属于说知识真理里面怎么去检验它是为真或是有价值的这样。那价值论里面主要是涉及到伦理学，我们那种信奉认同的价值，然后跟人之间相处那种哪些是善的关系啊，怎么是好的正义的，去平等的这样。那美学里面是处理那种什么是让我们可以觉得是美的超然的那种 而且游戏的愉悦的这种自由的想象的这种特质这样。基本上形上学常面临说反形上学那种影响上，形上学对世界万物的基本上属于对世界万物的跟世界的假定里面，宇宙论是探讨世界构成如何，到底是一元还是多元，从盘古开天地啊，到最后怎么去哪些地方变成山，哪些变成河流，哪些地方变成什么大陆丘陵啊，哪些地方变成凹地这样。然后本体论适中万物最终的本质在哪里，又可以分成观念论跟实在论。观念论他们认为说柏拉图最终真理在我们脑中的想法，然后实在论会认为说最终的真理在于说世间万物里面，我们看到一个椅子，我们分析出来每个不同的椅子里面有什么共同点，都是什么材质做的然后都为了人家作为目的而被产生透过什么加工程序这样，基本上那个形上学想法都会处理到这些问题。那不过近来有些反形上学认为说重点不是那种外在的东西，认为说要从人类出发里面谈到人的在世尊有，我们主观的诠释的意义生成。前面这个会比较客观的真理，这个是主观的意义这样。存在主义、分析哲学、后结构主义、现代论述，还有第一个分析者后来走向日常语言分析里面，想要概念跟语言语义到一个语用，在哪个情境里面，比如说你好棒你真是好棒棒棒的，可以拍拍手，放烟火，送出国。同样，也许在不同情境里面，我刚刚这种也许是一个讽刺调讽的这样子，你这样做很棒我真的是非常佩服你。这个就比较肯定嘛。同样类似的句子里面，在不同情境脉络里面有不同观点，就比较反对这种前面这种形上学里面，他反对有本质假定这种东西。但他们这种会认为说很多真理是这种后天所建构出来社会建构的那种面向，这里面也会偏向本质论的一种观点这样。我们刚刚讲观念主义跟唯识主义不同，观念主义是说所有的知识在我们脑袋中，在我们还没出生之前，我们在宇宙之中天上什么东西都懂，因为出生太痛忘记，所以我们教育就是要引出，要让你回忆说那种共相的一些共同普世皆用的法则。那唯识主义它也算理性的，它主要是强调说，不是那个重点不是说你出生下来就有，而是我们看到世界万物怎么去归纳出一些初象之间的原理原则出来。比如说界门纲目科属种，哪几种动物里面就叫爬虫类，哪几种动物叫鸟类，因为鸟类有翅膀然后什么有嘴喙就有什么爪子能够飞翔这种。哪些动物叫哺乳类，那里面可能涉及到那种哺育小孩或常温动物之类的那种定义，这样去归纳出原理原则出来这样。那本理论之争后期他们原本这种唯心或唯物为真的地方走向一个调和。康德认为说可以透过先验的自性范畴，把感性跟理性的区分里面，透过理性来把那个后面的唯识的经验里面，透过那种感性跟理性的感性说，我今天感官上收集的资料，透过知性的那种范畴去把它分门别类，最后透过理性的思考去形成观念了。那你说这两个观念跟实在两个之间都从实在来，但是最后会根据观念里面去做一个那个探究这样一个统合整合这样，因为是背后嘛那种先验的理性，普遍每个人都有先验理性这样。那杜威那实验主义他认为说不是没有先验这种东西我们每个人的经验都是不断的新经验旧经验新经验就会里面不断的人有机体就是人有机体就是人在环境之中去互动出来，跟情境互动里面，我今天情境里面感受如何，我做出行为改变情境，是因为回过头来让我引发感受，然后我就一些思考感受行为，比如说他讲那个做跟受之间的有机互动，经验不断的组织与再造，在每个情境之中，人跟情境中互动这样，然后最终会要一个有意义的经验，必须要一个完整的经验，不能够说我去尿尿那个不是一个完整经验。除非尿尿里面可能会发现到一些什么人生的大道理里面特别印象深刻。或者今天去吃一顿饭也不是个完整经验，我看也许说除非说你这顿饭里面有发现这里面今天拿那个美食，这几个餐点的美食真的非常棒，写下一个心得这样。他说只是嘴巴吃饭完就没有，每天都会吃饭嘛。那如果背后没有不是完整经验的话，就不会有意义这样子，就零碎的刺激这样。基本上知识或认识对知识问题的探讨，包含说知识的本质在哪里，形上学本体论的假定，最终的本质特质是什么？第二个是什么知识最重要？也许会涉及到价值论的认同选择。 哪些知识是比较相对有价值，哪些知识比较相对没价值。第三个，如何验证知识是否真实的，和前后是否一致，或者说我今天说的观点，事实是不是有证明，或者我今天说的知识到底有没有用上。第四个，我们透过什么方式学习知识？人类透过什么方式、能力、管道、媒介来获得知识或者建构知识呢？第五个，我们如何教导知识？老师在进行教学时，教学设计时可以按照什么原则或教学方法进行教学？基本上对知识有两种本源的观点，第一个是说我们刚刚讲寄存的，就你讲跟形上学有关的嘛，对客观事体的假设，一种是包含在观念界中，心中是真理；第一个是实在界，根据世间万物归纳原理原则出来，也是一个普世的理性的作用的。第二个是知识是建构，他认为说，其实这些本来无一物啊，都是我们主体的意义诠释的建构，包含个人的建构，还有我们社会集体的结构，和互为主体，人跟人之间互相视野交融，我看到你看到，彼此对话，然后增广增益彼此的那种视野，去获得那种建构的知识。当然，我今天看到 A， 你看到 B， 我们两个交谈之后有 A 跟 B 的，每个人都有 A 跟 B 的。今天又来个 C， 他看过 C 再这样加进来，然后每个人都可以看到 A、B、C 不同的观点这样。那这样子的话，那知识就不是一个永恒不变的，不是客观，绝对客观的，是会不断变动。前面这个是知识是寄存，就不会变动，是我们去等待我们去发现出一个是原本在我们心中就存在，一个是我们后天透过不同感官经验里面去归纳、分析、理解出来的东西这样。你看，基本上刚刚讲知识五大来源，透过感觉的、感官的收集资料，你看到的、听到的、摸到的、体感的这种知识。第二个是理性的、思辨的。第三个是权威，今天教授说的就是对啊，今天那个什么孔夫子说的都对啊，名人经典，或者说马云说什么，贾博士说什么。第四个是直观，强调感性非理性直接的领悟，灵光一闪，这样突然间顿悟啊。整体性原来是这样子，这个里面也许是被动收集资料，然后是理性知识，这里面可以突然间非感性非理性，突然间就是这样子。天启做梦的时候梦到可能是妈祖娘娘托梦啊，观世音佛祖然后上帝托梦说应该要怎么样这样。应该在我们知识的价值里面看到说 Grundy 曾借从哈伯马斯兴趣所去探讨，有些人追求技术的理性，那如果用在课程理论上试课程及产品。去探究说，怎么去设出用 SOP 的流程里面设出一个最有效率，我们可以最有 CP 值的那种课程出来，然后认为说这个是最有用的课程知识。一个是实际的兴趣，认为说重要不是说一个固定的 SOP， 而是在不同场域之中运用里面，实际应用里面那种诠释意义这样子。第三个是解放的情绪，那认为说有用的知识是课程实践。能够让人家发现那种意识觉醒到一些社会不公平的权力关系作用，懂得去那种自我真人，然后并懂得去抗拒跟那种对抗那种问题，然后进而改善或者解放全体人类那种使命的落实这样。基本上哈伯马斯的观点是认为说，知识可以分成三个要素，针对着劳动、语言、兴趣。行动，劳动涉及到工具性的行动，语言涉及到沟通性的行动，权力涉及到被扭曲的沟通，然后劳动主要关注取向是技术控制的，语言是强调互为主体，权力是一种开放、自主、负责、人性的那种解放。所以说，认识的秩序说，我们寻求真理目的是为了第一个追求技术 SOP 流程是取得最大利益，第二个是实践的秩序，强调我们做法里面到底有没有意义啊，有没有成效这样。这个解放程序怎么去那种打破束缚的关系啊，然后去打破我们限制困境啊，去带来透过批判反省解放实践出一种新的可能这样。所以说这个劳动的类别是属于经验分析，这个是历史诠释，这个是批判取向。主要如果在这些取向知识论，经验分析关注客观世界控制预测，重视现象的律则规律性。历史诠释关注他人的动机跟意向性的理解，然后互相沟通，视野交融之间共识。如果批判取向克服意识权利的宰制关系，然后从结构规范规约中去解放跟自主。方法论里面劳动的那种技术兴趣重视律则假设的验证，那实践的兴趣重视文本的诠释解释，解放的兴趣认识说意识形态的批判跟反省。文本就很多不同说法啦， 的那种不同资料啊里面的看法这样。然后劳动力认为说，怎么获得知识的原因是透过不同讯息里面的讯息的整理啊、变相的控制啊，然后语言里面是透过解释背后的意义，权利的那种解放的兴趣里面透过批判去发展批判意识，去解决问题这样。那另外一个学者 Hackerson 他从那个 Erikson-Jones 河流领域里面找出4个知识获得途径的典范，第一个是理性理论的典范，第二个是神话实际的典范，第3个是演进转化的典范，第4个是批判规范典范。他并以河流领域来说明这种典范。翁森老师曾解释说，基本上理性理论典范就像是我研究者跟研究对象是河流，我站在河的旁边去看河流，我跟他完全没有关系，这样是个绝对客观的那种情形，这样理性的思辨、客观的思辨，没有涉入其中的那种思辨的。第2个是神话的、神秘的、实际的只去典范上，神秘就开始试图说，坐着船里面顺流而下去看看，这条溪流有什么东西，里面可能是一些未知啊的让大家实际踏入一个未知的情境里面去感受、去发现到一些原则这样。第3个是转化的观点，演进的转化观点，也许我开始踏入河流之中呢，亲身体验，去感受到那种我自己感受到的意义这样子。这个是批判规范的，我在我自己感受完之后是跳脱那种自己摄入其中里面，进一步去批判反思说那背后里面踏入水中里面背后隐藏的一些结构啊、一些问题啊东西这样子，然后进行我就是河流里面那种在质疑解放重建这样子，等于说从河流踏回来，有没有看起这个是完全2分的，就开始间接的在船上去碰这个河流，接触这个场域，这个是亲身的脚踏实地踏入这个场域之中去感受，去逐渐的去感觉这里面的一些意义跟认同。这里面也许不再是只是完全涉于河流，跟河流融为一体之后，又可以踏回原本的沙滩里面跟人家解释说呢，或者说跟人家描述说，这里面到底我所研究跟我这个研究的立场两个我之间怎么获得哪些成长这样，等于说研究连自己也是研究的对象，那研究对象可以后设反思里面去探讨一些归纳出一些问题，然后发现一些问题，找出一些，然后质疑反思，提出新的一些见解，超越自身这样。基本上我们刚刚讲知识的判准，什么知识是对的，有3种观点，一个叫符合论。观念，我今天的讲法跟外物一致这样，比如说我说，今天会下雨，今天如果24小时过去有雨滴落下来，真的是有今天会下雨这样子。我说，今天你们7-11有没有在打折？星巴克买1送1，真的跑到星巴克去看有没有买1送1，然后那个跑到7-11也去看有没有在打折，就可以验证这样子。第2个是融贯论，总体的有机协调。我前面所说跟后面所说有没有自打嘴巴？前面所说我好几年没有出国去玩了，然后后面讲我从美国最近几个礼拜之前从美国了，带来一些东西非常有趣，那里面就都不在一起，在里面就是逻辑的那种不一致这样，符合论是一种比较实证的事实的不一致，不一致这样，融贯是讲到前后左右那种有没有一致性这样，有没有扣合在一起。第一个效果论，真理就是行过效果，有用之为生啊，就是我们讲那个不管黑猫或是白猫，只要会抓老鼠的就是好猫。你要获得知识途径的争议啊，前面讲的那本质的预设，一个是透过理性思辨，一个是透过经验的那种感受的反思这样，有不同学者。理性主义代表到苏格拉底、柏拉图、亚里士多德，经验主义代表毕格多拉斯、伊比鸠鲁，强调亲身去体验的。理性主义在启蒙时代里面代表笛卡尔、斯宾诺莎，莱布尼兹我思故我在的笛卡尔，然后斯宾诺莎的那种单元论，然后莱布尼兹的单子论，讲到世界可以拆解成一些元素，探讨它关系。经验主义毕卡拉斯跟伊比鸠鲁要发现那个感官的一些原理，洛克那个心灵如白板，透过感官感受去反思获得。培根要怀疑一些没有经过验证的东西，这样子都是自己 to believe 这样。休谟怀疑主义的，然后伯克莱，然后裴斯陶奇、科夫贝尔这种会比较强调由经验而来，不是说那种绝对客观。他们有点 更重视人的那种感觉，人的主体的一些意义这样。基本上本体论跟认识论两个阵营里面，我觉得本体论就事物的本质，我们该追求什么？观念主义追求心中的一些想法才是普世真理。唯识主义是说那种万物归纳出来原理原则才是真理。那怎么获得呢？一种是理性思辨，一个是感官经验探索来的。这个理性思辨里面跟观念主义代表人物是柏拉图，但另外一派同样是理性主义，理性思辨去获得知识了。另外一个强调从事件万物去归纳进行思辨，这亚里士多德。然后经验主义里面强调最终真理是观念，但是我们透过经验来或者观念是伯克莱。然后另外就是那个休谟，他是认为说我们世界万物里面透过一些经验的那种偶然性的那种连接形成知识的这样子，而不是说那种既定的原理原则普世皆用，它里面有讲偶然性的知识在。基本上我们在社会科学研究典范里面可以分成几个派别，那些执行研究手册里面提到几个，第一个是实证主义，第二个是后实证主义，第三个是批判理论，第四个是建构理论，第五个是参与式研究。基本上这里面都有不同的本体论、认识论、方法论的预设。本体论实证主义是本质的实在论，客观的真理，所以认识论强调二元论，那我站在河流外面看你，然后客观主义，我发现的事实是实验性的。后实证批判实在论修正了二元论，是客观主义，但是我会发现到那种不是所有规则不是普遍通用，里面也许有例外，所以这种修正的实验性，你会看到不同情境里面的例外这样。批判理论历史实在性，探究是互异的真实，然后主观主义价值的发现，想要对话跟辩证的方式去批判解放这样。结构理论相对论呢是互异的真实，讲到主观主义共同创造的发现。这里面探讨哪些是公平正义的基原理这里面是共同意义的创造，包含诠释跟辩证。参与式的真实，讲到批判主义的宇宙论的环宇就宇宙论经验的扩展，透过实践中从做中学的，然后行动研究的，共同创造发现的，然后合作行动的政治参与跟直击脉络的语言去改善问题这样。那这些问题里面基本上涉及了知识的本质、知识的聚集、品质、长处跟品质规准、探究者姿态、训练，都会不同主义里面会带来不同的一些执行研究的一些做法这样子。但是我们看到说，从它典范的一些发展趋势嘛，从早期的实证到后实证，到甚至批判理论建构主义那个诠释主义然后那种叙事探究然后自传民族志、行动研究这些发展里面有一点越纳入很多主观，甚至互为主观性去取代绝对客观性的那种一分证据说一分话那种追求，更着重于意义的那种建构。意义的那种不只是发现而已，包含说社会是建构，真理知识是建构，以及抗拒发现说里面一些权力运作问题、宰制的问题，怎么去突破权力的压榨的那种抗拒的行动这样。好，那我们最后一部分我们来看一下那个两个影片好了。第一个是米德的一些介绍。
During a time when Americans rarely considered how people of other cultures live their lives, one person proved that understanding cultures is essential to understanding your own. This was Margaret Mead. Margaret Mead's exploration of societies in the South Pacific demonstrated how human behavior varies based on culture, revolutionizing both American viewpoints and modern anthropology. Mead's interest in anthropology began at a young age. Born in Philadelphia on December 16, 1901, to progressive social scientist parents, Mead's curiosity was sparked through studies of her mother's. Mead was an observant child. Because her parents were both educators, Mead was taught to contemplate the world around her and kept several journals documenting her life. Mead attended several universities, receiving a bachelor's and master's degree in psychology. Later, while taking classes from Franz Boas, a well-known anthropologist, and his assistant Ruth Benedict at Columbia, Mead decided to pursue a PhD in anthropology, the study of humans and their culture. Anthropology had begun to materialize in the 1860s after Charles Darwin's theory of evolution linked human ancestry to apes. Darwin's discovery led to many scientists exploring what was called evolutionist anthropology, which involved studying universal biological ideas. However, Boas looked at anthropology a different way, studying humanity through different cultures. This was called social anthropology, a new idea in the 1920s. Even outside of anthropology, the 1920s was a revolutionary period in America because of the great changes in societal norms and new cultural ideas. However, the emergence of the Great Depression caused hard times, especially for children and teens, who were expected to work long hours in order to support their families. Stereotypes were prevalent during this time as well. People of color, immigrants, and people of certain religions were discriminated against. Women, although granted the vote, were still denied many freedoms. Mead would soon refute many of the cultural stereotypes in America. Her experience with fieldwork, a modern anthropological idea, began in 1925. Boas decided to send her to American Samoa, an isolated island outside of the modern world. The overarching purpose of the study was to determine whether human behavior was primarily biologically or culturally induced. Mead's focus was on adolescent girls. Through conversing with 68 girls and taking notes, Mead discovered that Samoans had a much easier transition into adulthood than American teens. Samoan culture was more open sexually, and teens often had many sexual relationships. Society was also more carefree for teens, and Mead found that Samoan teens lacked the typical anger and storminess of those of America. This led Mead to believe the unwillingness to let American teens grow up at their own pace or teach them about love, sex, and birth was a cultural norm, negatively impacting American teens' development. Mead returned to America in 1926 and in 1928 published Coming of Age in Samoa, a book describing her research and conclusions about adolescence. The book quickly gained popularity in America. Following the publishing of her book in 1928, Mead set off for her next field study, this time in Manus, Papua New Guinea. She wanted to study children in pre-literate cultures and whether their development depended on their environment. Through collecting over 35,000 drawings made by children of New Guinea, Mead found children drew only realistic depictions of life around them, despite the supernatural being a big part of adult life in the culture. Based on the study, Mead refuted the idea that animism is a universal developmental stage, as the children do not believe in the supernatural. She also argued against the idea that primitive societies are more childlike because what is considered childlike depends on the culture. Mead published the book Growing Up in New Guinea to describe her research in 1930, which was another successful book in the market. In 1931, Mead decided to return to New Guinea with her then-husband Gregory Bateson. She and Bateson wanted to study and compare three tribes in the Sepik region, the Arapesh, the Bundugamor, and the Chambuli. Her goal was to find out whether gender roles were determined based on culture. Through her field research among the tribes, Mead found that the three tribes had very different standards for male and female behavior. In the Arapesh tribe, women and men were both peaceful and calm, a trait associated with women in America. The opposite was shown in the Bundugamor tribe, where both men and women were more aggressive and combative. The Chambuli tribe was the most surprising, as women were the dominant gender. The men relied on them and were very emotional, a characteristic linked to women in America. This led Mead to draw the conclusion that gender roles were largely culturally determined, going against the American view at the time that women were inferior biologically. Her book, Sex and Temperament in Three Primitive Societies, published in 1935, described this study. It was the third of Mead's over 20 published books. Mead's work was far from over. One of her later major trips occurred from 1936 to 39 in Bali, and was centered around culture's effect on personality. Mead and Bateson compiled 35,000 pictures and 33,000 feet of film to demonstrate Balinese culture, rituals, and interactions. This original idea of visual anthropology was appreciated by many anthropologists as well as the general public. After Mead conducted many field studies, World War II began in 1941, making travel to the South Pacific impossible. During this time, Mead remained in America, focusing her fieldwork on the war. Mead was influential during the war, contributing to efforts by researching the purposes of war, food distribution, and how to maintain morale. In her later years, Mead focused on American culture, teaching at many universities, publishing many books, and working as a curator at the American Museum of Natural History. She returned to the South Pacific in the 1950s to study changes in primitive life. Due to her fieldwork and books, Mead became a well-known anthropologist, one of the most famous of her time. She traveled around the country, dedicating her time to speaking on international problems such as women's rights, parenting, education, sexuality, racism, drugs, pollution, and war.
We are indeed honored to have this great woman with us today, Margaret Mead.
A main part of Mead's lectures focused on the importance of understanding other cultures and how Americans can learn from them.
The word tolerate's a good word to use if a Republican's thinking about a Democrat, or a Democrat about a Republican. They got to tolerate each other's differences because they feel differently about important things. People of different religions have to tolerate their differences of opinion. But other cultures are other whole things, other whole ways of life which we have to learn to appreciate.
One of Mead's most promising messages to society during her time was that culture and societal norms can be changed. During a period of time when many citizens had given up hope for change in society, Mead was convinced social problems could be overcome.
Human culture is something that people have built up historically. It's different from other people's just because of the historical conditions, and also it's something we can change.
Though many valued Mead's work, she was also a controversial figure. Many people viewed her ideas on women's rights, sexual life, and other topics as radical and absurd, mainly because many Americans still had traditional mindsets. Her book, Coming of Age in Samoa, was particularly controversial. Derek Freeman, another anthropologist, traveled to Samoa and found the way Samoans lived conflicting with the life Mead had described. He wrote a book criticizing Mead's ideas, research method, and accuracy. Freeman and other anthropologists also argued Mead's conclusions were drawn from little evidence just to make her point. Whether Mead's critics are correct or not, there is no doubting Mead's impact on society. The exchange of her modern ideas revolutionized the way Americans viewed culture and international topics. She made anthropology a more well-known and approachable subject through her easily readable Margaret books. Mead died on November 15, 1978 with 28 honorary doctorates and is the president of many scientific organizations. Praised by many, she was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom following her death. Even today, Margaret Mead's mark on society is great. She has endless contributions to anthropology, her fieldwork in many oceanic cultures, her novel research methods including photography and film, and her study of the human character. In addition, her contention that traits are culturally inherited revolutionized the way anthropologists today approach their studies. Outside of anthropology, Mead sparked a movement of social change. Considered a leader in the feminist and sexuality movements, Mead's advocacy on social issues has helped remove prejudices and misconceptions. Her participation in international conferences, public speeches, and books spread her concern for humanity to areas around the world. Mead is remembered today in many ways as an oracle, a mother, a revolutionary, an intellect and a role model, a humanist, and more. Mead's exploration of cultures at a humanitarian rather than biological level, as well as her social impact on society, were monumental and are still recognized today.
The story of Bronislaw Malinowski is one of the greatest tales in anthropology. Almost 100 years ago, his short visit to some remote islands of Papua New Guinea turned into a 4-year odyssey. Here, Malinowski started a revolution in anthropology. He left behind the colonial settlements to live cheek by jowl with the natives. His experience would overturn the Victorian notion of the simple savage and transform the way we look at our own society. But with the publication of his private diaries in 1967, a complex truth about the man began to come out. Who really was Malinowski, and what drove him to become the founder and hero of modern social anthropology? In 1942, at Yale University, some battered notebooks were found on top of a cupboard. They were the private diaries of Bronislaw Malinowski, the man who founded modern social anthropology. For a further 25 years, these diaries were a closely guarded secret, until 1967, when their publication sent shockwaves through the world of anthropology.
His attitude was rather unpleasant and rather superior, and not an ideal model for younger anthropologists.
The diaries from this hero was shown to have feet of clay, to be a lustful, indiscreet, arrogant, lying, racist at times. He was all the things that they wished he wasn't.
The diaries laid bare the dark side of a revered academic figure. This film reveals a man driven close to the edge of reason in his passionate pursuit not only of a new science, but of his own power and prestige. London, 1910. The bustling hub of the British Empire and the greatest city in the world. That March, a poor but well-born young Pole arrived and fell in love.
My Anglomania has become something more akin to a mystic cult, worshipping at the altar of British culture.
Fascinated by England's social structure, Malinowski desired to be part of the upper classes.
I both admire and fear the English way of life. Its elegance and refinement. Indeed, they are the very aristocracy of the nations. A highly superior nation where one is only tolerated if one is amusing.
His surviving daughter and great-grandson bear out his desire for acceptance.
There's a photograph of him at a dinner party, and he's obviously very pleased that he's with Sir Thingamy and Lord Whatnot and the Duchess of Blah, and who's to blame him? No.
Me.
You. Okay, well, you're an American. You can't help yourself.
Without personal wealth to help him on his way, Malinowski would have to rely on the one thing he...
It's happening again. Our land is screaming in agony. Centuries ago, an ancient enemy of the elves
did have brains.
I'm determined that I shall be accepted into this aristocracy. And the one thing I have to proffer is my extraordinary intellect. It is this that will make me important. I shall be an eminent scholar. Do you think?
His brains took him to the London School of Economics, where he plumped for the little understood subject of anthropology. It means literally the study of man. As the British Empire expanded, it encountered a world of mysterious tribes, cannibals, and curious traditions. The Victorians wanted to find a way of classifying these bizarre and exotic cultures.
collecting objects was part of that process of making sense of human variety, and the different objects that people made and used were indicative in many ways of the sorts of societies that they had.
To Victorians, the people who made these objects appeared savage. And what's more, these savages performed magic, tattooed their bodies, and even practiced promiscuous sex. Their lifestyle sent decent Victorian folk into a spin of moral panic and terror.
In the popular mind, a savage was someone who was at the mercy of their emotions, wasn't fully in control of their rational thought, and therefore was sort of blown hither and thither by changing emotional forms. Right at the heart of the notion of savagery were both sex and violence, basically.
The study of these savages and everything they did was anthropology. Its experts were respectable gentlemen who considered the savage was best studied from a safe distance.
These were known as armchair anthropologists, people who lived in places like London, Oxford, New York, and either didn't travel very much themselves or didn't travel at all. And what they did was, often by writing letters, was to get a whole series of accounts from travellers and colonial officials, missionaries around the world, about the customs of the people that they were in contact with.
Perusing these reports in their armchairs, they formulated a theory on savage life.
The usual idea was that these people were so-called primitive people. They were more or less equivalent to the most ancient of our own ancestors. And so they must represent something which is the opposite of ourselves. If we are monogamous, they must be promiscuous. If we live in homes, they must be nomadic. If we are rational people believing in all sorts of rational things, they just are completely enthralled to superstition, believing, and so on. So they are the opposite of ourselves, however we imagine ourselves.
Mitsubishi Denki.
The expedition is nearing the country inhabited by the real bad men of Australia, wild blacks who have never seen a white. Prehistoric beings sprung from a race said to be 500,000 years old.
Savages seem to be a throwback to a prehistoric past, and their primitive societies the relics of man's march towards civilization.
Almost always it was Australian Aboriginal people were seen to be at the bottom of the ladder of evolution, and then there were chiefly societies, people like the Tahitians and so on, who were part way up, and then came the state societies of the Chinese, and then laughable to us a little bit further up were other European nations like the Italians, who are said to be a bit sort of irrational and emotional, and of course right at the pinnacle of evolution were the good old rational thought.
In 1910, when Malinowski began to study anthropology, it was the Australian Aborigines that were under particular scrutiny. Reports told of promiscuity and multiple sexual partners. It was the Aborigines' apparent lack of any family structure that confirmed their place at the base of social evolution. But Malinowski wasn't impressed with this conclusion.
Everyone acquainted with ethnographic information in general, and that of Australia and its Aborigines in particular, knows how ambiguous and confused it is on nearly every point.
Keen to get ahead in his new line of work, Malinowski took a thorough look at all the data on Aboriginal family life.
He looks at all this material, at the Australian material. He looks at censuses. He looks at photographs. He looks at descriptions of who are interacting with whom in the villages.
And his research led him to a radically different conclusion.
He says, well, look, whatever these people are telling you it's quite clear that they are living in something very much like what we would call families. You have a man with 1 or 2, sometimes 3 women whom he's living with on a long-term basis, over whom he has more or less exclusive rights of various kinds, including sexual rights. Their children are very close to him. They live together in 1 or 2 adjoining huts. They cook together, they eat together. Well, that's a family. Malinowski said, it looks like a family, it talks like it's a family, even if it doesn't call itself a family.
This initial research confirmed his view that anthropology was riddled with prejudices and lacked rigor. Malinowski was one of those who concluded that anthropology needed a strong dose of scientific discipline. And with a degree in maths and physics, he had exactly the right credentials.
The work of scientifically trained observers, like myself, once seriously applied to anthropology, will yield results of surpassing value. So far it has been done solely by amateurs, and therefore done, on the whole, indifferently.
Not only was Malinowski a scientist, but his peculiarly obsessive personality was ideally suited to the task ahead. Malinowski's life was one long struggle for personal perfection, both mentally and physically.
Particularly from reading the diaries, I thought that he had this really introspective side where he was, I thought his diary, I think he saw it as a tool.
He was a perfectionist for himself.
You know,
yes, yes.
Yeah.
He wished to make his life perfect if he could.
He meticulously scrutinized every aspect of himself.
With me, the extremism in self-analysis is pathological, and it leads towards a morbid exaggeration.
First, there was his alarmist obsession with health.
He's such a hypochondriac. Pill bottles everywhere. Do you think that comes from being sick as a child?
I think he was a born hypochondriac, perhaps is the wrong word, but it's possible. You know, he's obviously a sensitive being, you know. but
putting it mildly.
Putting it mildly.
His nervous disposition was so extreme that Malinowski relied on the somewhat dubious panacea of the time, regular injections of arsenic. There were also the intricacies of Malinowski's complex mind.
There is a craving in me for the sensational, for the abnormal. I suspect ill of others and imagine dreadful possibilities.
He says on one occasion in his diary is, I have a fear of pointed objects. Stickophobia, I call it. And fur, he didn't like touching fur coats or anything like that. Velvet and anything slippery, mud. Several times a day he'd rub his hands with hot water and soap.
In short, I suffer from a mania of paranoia and persecution. And all this was hand in hand with my poor health and my bad nerves. Though perhaps the one feeds upon the other.
Malinowski's obsessive analysis of himself, combined with his scientific mind, would make him the man that could change anthropology. By 1914, the more forward-thinking of the profession were keen on their students taking the equivalent of an anthropological gap year. For Malinowski, this consisted of a grand tour of Australia and its remote territories. Leaving behind his beloved mother, he set off on a busy schedule with many stop-offs. After 3 months, Malinowski reached Papua New Guinea. Even today, it is a wild-looking land of jungle, swamp, and mysterious cultures.
Popular imagination, I suppose Papua was a dark, cannibal-ridden, a savage place. I mean, a real redoubt of savages. The government was always saying how difficult it was, to pacify this place. Travel writers were reporting on it as being a rather malaria-ridden, unhealthy place for Europeans, but fascinating with these colourful customs and colourful natives.
This dark place was the essence of all things primitive and a dream come true for the young anthropologist. But being a sickly, self-obsessed hypochondriac, Papua New Guinea was also Malinowski's own private hell.
He knew he was entering into a dangerous place. What worried him, I think, more than anything else was the heat.
I have a strong fear of the tropics, an abhorrence of heat, sultriness. Overtaxed heart, nervousness. There is a taste in my mouth and a pain behind my eyes. I think I may vomit. If I do, I'm sure it is tuberculosis. Now, perhaps the lack of exercise is at the root of this condition. Or the tinned food. I must get more exercise, especially in the morning. And in the evening. Arsenic is indispensable, but I must not exaggerate the quinine. Also a somewhat congested nose and throat. I am beginning to believe the hypothesis that I am about to die.
Malinowski was expected to tour around, studying a number of different tribes. But off the east coast of Papua, on the far-flung archipelago of the Trobriand Islands, he came to a crucial realization. It was an insight that would help him transform anthropology. Early one morning, Malinowski joined the local islanders to watch an ancient custom. The natives had told him that this was a sacred ceremony called Yoba. With drums and chants, they send the spirits of their ancestors, called the Baloma, back to a sacred afterworld. The natives' reports seem to suggest that Yoba was a solemn occasion, which everyone took very seriously. But that's not what Malinowski saw.
The priest directing the ritual is on his own in a corner muttering away the prayers and incantations that he's been told, and most of the people are not paying the blind bit of attention to him.
When the Tsakau sang out, everybody just walked off. The only ones left to chase off the Baloma were myself, 5 or 6 urchins, and Ginger, the cook, and very undignified we were too.
They're chattering away, they're laughing, they're looking after their children. And he says there are a whole lot of children woozing around, small boys making a big fuss, terribly overexcited and so on.
Yoba is undoubtedly important, but in its performance it bears no trace of sanctity or solemnity. It was not so much a religious proceeding, it was a party.
The reality he observed bore no relation to the reports he'd heard of natives being in awe of the ancient spirits. It was a critical moment for Malinowski.
I suddenly realized, with astounding clarity, that to understand people, you cannot rely upon what they say they do. Instead, you must rely upon yourself, watching and seeing what they do.
You realize that people tell you one thing but do something else. Not because they're lying to you, but they're just like a football player explains the rules of football to you, but isn't really giving you an insight into how he plays football, or into the tactics and strategy which he probably can't articulate very well, but which can act out for you and which you can see in action.
Malinowski realized that anthropology's tradition of relying only on what other people say was shockingly flawed. If he was going to fully understand Trobriand culture, he would have to get much closer to native life. So instead of travelling on, Malinowski decided to stay in the Trobriand Islands. He gave up his lodgings with the local colonists and pitched a tent in a village right amongst the natives.
Malinowski decides to come down from the veranda, go into the village and pitch his tent there. And it's so important that because he wanted to move away from the idea of just having locals come to him to answer his set of questions, a questionnaire framed in terms of his categories, his understandings, his priorities.
Malinowski wasn't just moving in, he would immerse himself in every detail of Trobriand life in order to get to the truth about their native culture.
As the natives see me every day, they stop being interested or alarmed or even self-conscious in my presence. I have become part and parcel of their life. A necessary evil mitigated by regular donations of tobacco. By living with the natives and taking part in village life, I am learning the native's point of view, his relation to life, and thereby his vision of the world.
From now on, Malinowski wouldn't be a mere observer. By learning the local language, he would become a participant observer.
Malinowski was good at participant observation because he was such a determined, dogged character. I think he realized during his fieldwork that this was the way forward, that he had a revolutionary technique on his hands. This is going to change anthropology forever. It's going to set a completely new precedent.
But what he didn't yet realize was that he'd also started his own personal odyssey. Events conspired to make this one of the longest field trips ever. In 1914, World War I broke out. The British Empire was at war with Germany.
And what changes things for Malinowski is this accident of being caught in Australia during World War I. I mean, it's really an extraordinary moment.
With Europe in chaos, his camping trip would last longer than a few months. Apart from the odd trip to Australia, Malinowski now felt abandoned, alone in the jungle, with only the so-called savages for company.
The sun is almost dipping into the perfectly still lagoon. The woman next door has begun her wailing. And it is also inexpressibly sad in its remoteness and detachment from my life. I am stranded here, far from all that makes life bearable. It is as if I have no place to return to.
But there was an upside. This forced isolation would allow him time to really uncover the truth about Trobriand culture. And soon he was getting very close to the natives indeed.
A pretty, finely built girl walked ahead of me. I watched the muscles of her back, her figure, her legs, and the beauty of her body, so hidden to us whites, fascinated me. At times, I was sorry I was not a savage and could not possess this little animal.
For a man who prided himself on objective precision in his work, Malinowski's love life was a chaotic shambles.
He would feel great gusts of passion, and he'd be jealous at the slightest hint of any infidelity. Very, very powerful infatuation, schoolboy-like crushes, if you like.
He fell in love with every woman.
I'm always thinking this is the one, yes?
Yeah, I mean, the way he writes about each woman, I'm in, this passion, but then there's, so many of them, just
Which one am I talking about today?
Okay. And at the same time, it's like this mix of being a complete sort of lecherous fool and this romantic, who's really... deeply feels every relationship.
This man, filmed in the 70s, remembered Malinowski's stay in his village. Whatever actually happened, his gusts of passion were met with equal gusts of remorse. Even when visiting Australia, where he had 2 girlfriends, including his fiancée Elsie, he couldn't keep his eyes off a third.
I sat up with one of the older women. She is not stupid, but neither is she cultured. However, I found myself undressing her in my mind and calculating how long it would take me to bed her. In short, I betrayed Elsie in my mind. And as for Mother, I cannot bear to think of her missing me. I am appalled by my lack of moral fiber. My own death would be the best way out of this muddle.
Despite this inner turmoil, his work of participant observation was about to pay off. 6 months after arriving, Malinowski began to study an ancient tradition that really intrigued him. He noted that every few months, islanders would build fleets of elaborately decorated canoes as part of a tradition known as kula. For kula, they set out on voyages, leaving behind friends and family for months at a time. And kula voyages from neighbouring islands would be awaited with great anticipation.
What you would see over the horizon, these tiny, tiny canoes converging until there might be 60 or 80 or possibly 100. You will suddenly see people on the island start going into the sea to meet these canoes. And as the canoes come nearer, the people going into the sea will recognize individuals on the canoes.
Kula visitors were treated to great feasts, attracting hundreds of locals to these celebrations. Particularly striking were the risks the islanders were prepared to take for kula, as Malinowski himself discovered late one night sailing between islands.
We passed very close by a coral island, the sea smashing against the rocks. The islanders were all shouting, trying to control the craft. I was terrified. I started to think of Elsie, sleeping peacefully, and that I might never see her again. Once, the crews of a whole fleet of Trobriand canoes were captured, killed, and eaten by the inhabitants of unknown villages. And let's not forget the perils of simply sailing these seas. The reefs, sandbanks, and coral rocks waiting to smash the fragile canoes. The horror of it. All in the pursuit of Kula.
These islanders, it seemed, risked everything for Kula. And strangest of all, the reward for these perilous journeys was the exchange of flimsy shell trinkets. Kula was time-consuming and dangerous, all for something that seemed apparently pointless. Malinowski made it his goal to discover what it was about Kula that was worth risking your life for. Over the following months, he explored Kula from every angle. He questioned the locals, watched the rituals, and tried to make sense of it all. Gradually, the secrets of Kula began to unfold. And Kula voyages from neighbouring islands would be awaited with great anticipation.
What you would see over the horizon, these tiny, tiny canoes converging until there might be 60 or 80 or possibly 100. You will suddenly see people on the island start going into the sea to meet these canoes. And as the canoes come nearer, the people going into the sea will recognize individuals on the canoes.
Kula visitors were treated to great feasts, attracting hundreds of locals to these celebrations. Particularly striking were the risks the islanders were prepared to take for Kula, as Malinowski himself discovered late one night sailing between islands.
We passed very close by a coral island, the sea smashing against the rocks. The islanders were all shouting, trying to control the craft. I was terrified. I started to think of Elsie, sleeping peacefully, and that I might never see her again. Once, the crews of a whole fleet of Trobriand canoes were captured, killed, and eaten by the inhabitants of unknown villages. And let's not forget the perils of simply sailing these seas. The reefs, sandbanks, and coral rocks waiting to smash the fragile canoes. The horror of it. All in the pursuit of Kula.
These islanders, it seemed, risked everything for Kula. And strangest of all, the reward for these perilous journeys was the exchange of flimsy shell trinkets. Kula was time-consuming and dangerous, all for something that seemed apparently pointless. Malinowski made it his goal to discover what it was about Kula that was worth risking your life for. Over the following months, he explored Kula from every angle. He questioned the locals, watched the rituals, and tried to make sense of it all. Gradually, the secrets of Kula began to unfold.
There is such nonchalance in the men arriving for Kula, and nonchalance in the old men receiving them. They come, they sit on the canoe, they chatter and haggle, give in. I eat my rice and kippers and read my Kipling. We talk some more, and gradually I manage to drag out the information I'm after.
The information that he dragged out of the locals revealed a complex and sophisticated ritual. First, there were the people who took part.
Only important men could actually afford to go on a Kula expedition, partly because this meant commissioning a canoe, so it meant some sort of outlay.
Malinowski soon discovered that Kula was almost exclusive to the tribal chiefs and men of rank. These VIPs were connected by Kula to a social network that reached far beyond the Trobriand Islands. And at the heart of Kula were the shell trinkets.
In order to establish relationships with other people, you have to establish relationships with something. And these valuables are the means through which you establish relationships. And this means that people go on large expeditions to go and fetch valuables from elsewhere. They receive people who bring valuables to them. And the result is, if you link up all these relationships, suddenly you find you're in a huge chain of relationships. And this chain of relationships actually spreads across a large island area.
Malinowski uncovered a complex network of Kula exchange, covering 12 island groups spanning 200 miles of ocean. He also discovered why the shell necklaces and bracelets were so highly prized. Each one had a value that came from its unique history as it passed from person to person and from island to island. The value of each object lay in the renown of its former owners.
This is a history of relationships, and what he wants to know is who has had this before, and to whom he's going to, and when he passes it on, his own name will, in a sense, be part of the history of the item.
So these weren't simply shell trinkets. Each chain of shells was a potent symbol of power and prestige. Malinowski's participant observation had revealed that, far from being pointless, Kula played a vital role in Trobriand society, reinforcing the status of the rich and famous.
This is quite a ranked society, and poorer people simply didn't enter into the Kula exchanges. So this was renown and prestige that were there for those who already had renown and prestige. I mean, it sounds familiar, yeah.
And like a trophy won in battle, owning a piece of Kula made you a hero. Living with the natives for 2 years had paid off. Malinowski had revealed that an apparently meaningless native custom was, in reality, significant and crucial to Trobriand society. But his discovery came at some personal cost. On the 11th of June, 1918, after 4 years away from home, Malinowski received bad news. His beloved mother had died.
I do not know how I shall live through the immediate future. My life has changed completely. I am cut adrift. The link between my past and my present is broken. My life will be forever incomplete.
And he stopped writing his diary. He went crying into the bushes. This was a sort of heart of darkness for him.
I am alone. My heart is pierced with grief now that Mother has gone. Everything is now permeated with her. I know I have a void, a black abyss in my soul. All I desire is to die, to go to Mother, to join her in nothingness.
Deliverance came in November 1918. The war was over. Malinowski could at last return to Europe. In 1922, Malinowski published his fieldwork, Argonauts of the Western Pacific. His detailed descriptions revealed a fresh perspective of the natives.
His messages, they might look very different, they might live in a better climate, they might have more interesting sex lives, but they're very like you and me.
Into his world, dominated by class, imperialism and crude racial stereotypes, Malinowski introduced the radical idea that these savages were in fact sophisticated and rational human beings.
The islanders are just like us. Conniving, manipulative, industrious, like any Viennese businessman. And the constitution of the tribe is subject to a strict code of behavior and social niceties, in comparison with which life at the court of Versailles would seem free and easy.
Malinowski's giving you a real, breathing, talking, plausible human being in place of this old stereotype savage who's just the opposite of what you are. And this plausible human being that Malinowski is giving you is not somebody you admire particularly necessarily, any more than you admire your next door neighbor, but you recognize him. You say, aha, you know, I can see what he's up to. I can understand it. It makes sense to me, because he's rather like me in many ways.
Not only were Trobrianders just like us, but behind the apparent strange native customs, their societies were every bit as complex as our own.
When I returned to Europe, I visited Edinburgh Castle and was shown the crown jewels. The curator told stories about how they'd been worn by this or that king on such and such an occasion. And as I was looking at them and thinking how intrinsically tawdry they were, I had the feeling something similar had been told me of late. And suddenly, there rose before my eyes the image of a native village on coral soil, and of a brown, naked man showing me long red strings and worn-out objects, greasy to the touch. And these Trobriand Vegua valuables are cherished and revered in exactly the same way as those crown jewels, purely for the historical sentiment that surrounds them.
And Malinowski went further. Just as cooler shells were equivalent to our crown jewels, acquiring them was equal to our heroic sporting victories. And he believed these cultural similarities applied right across the globe. Shamanism and magic was similar to our grand religions. Maori tattoos were like medals of achievement.
Malinowski was very clever because what he did in a way was he civilized the savage and savaged the civilized. He showed that they weren't irrational, that they just had different cultural rules to ours.
To many, what Malinowski was proposing was nothing short of revolutionary. Humanity was the same the world over. And he thought he could reveal why with a big new idea in anthropology. Malinowski believed that he'd discovered the engine that drove all human cultures, and that engine could be found right at the heart of all of us.
What is the deepest essence of my investigations? The discovery of the native's passions, his motives, his aims, his essential way of thinking. And it is at this point that I am confronted with my own problems. My self-analysis leads me to ask, What is essential in me?
He said that everybody, everywhere, is driven by the same passions: hunger, fear, vanity, sex. What he began to propose was that all human cultures had a purpose. Every custom could be interpreted as serving a function in society, and that rituals have evolved to satisfy our basic needs. He called his theory functionalism. It could be applied to all societies, however sophisticated or apparently primitive. And when Malinowski's functionalism was applied to our own society, it promised a whole new way of seeing our familiar world. Today, Sophie is 4 years old. She's having a birthday party.
And I said, "Hello, Mr. Elephant."
At first sight, a toddler's birthday party is just about the toddlers. It's all of them having fun, and it's about gift giving.
In fact, there is a deeper social function to Sophie's party.
Look, you've got some sunglasses.
In fact, of course, if you look at it, there's a lot more going on. There's who's really inviting whom. And there are very clear decisions as to who is being invited on what basis. There's a sense of social obligation. If you have a group of mothers who've been invited to a toddler's party, well, they should feel obliged to invite that toddler back to theirs.
Ready to blow? Blow a bit harder.
Malinowski is pointing out how culturally constituted are so many of the activities and the ways in which we live, which we would otherwise think are just purely natural. It's the way we do things.
By unravelling different cultures, Malinowski had made us reflect more objectively upon ourselves and our own society.
Are we so superior? Are we so different? Don't we just have a large number of cultural rules by which we order our society? It's just that we start off from different premises.
By 1927, only 9 years after leaving the Trobrians, the charismatic young professor was leading his own department at LSE. Brilliant, autocratic and temperamental, Malinowski had a dramatic impact on all those who came under his spell.
People I knew who were his students, all the men, hated him, argued with him, but were obsessed by him. And the women loved him, without exception. All his women students adored him.
He used his influence to revolutionize anthropology.
From now on, Malinowski introduced the new apprenticeship in anthropology. You couldn't be an anthropologist in Britain after Malinowski without going and doing a year or 2 years as a participant observer, learning the language in some pretty exotic part of the world. It became the initiation ceremony without which you were never going to be a professional.
And a whole generation of his disciples spread out across the world, promoting this new anthropology. With his success, Malinowski had finally finished off Victorian anthropology.
After Malinowski, there was no more of the old armchair anthropology in British anthropology. It really was like turning a switch. That was the end of it in Britain.
Kate Fox is a modern-day anthropologist. Like Malinowski, she is a participant observer, relying on total immersion in another culture.
Traditionally, anthropologists are supposed to do their research like Malinowski did, in sort of remote, uncomfortable places with lots of dirt and dysentery and malaria and mud huts and so on. And I have a bit of a problem with that, because I have sort of pathetic, wimpish aversion to all that dirt and dysentery and horrible killer insects and primitive sanitation and so on. I like to do my research in cultures with indoor plumbing and where you can get a glass of champagne or a decent cup of tea and do a bit of retail therapy when the natives start getting on your nerves, that kind of thing. So Malinowski would not approve. But anyway, participant observation method is the same wherever you use it. And essentially I do, in this culture, exactly what Malinowski was doing in the Trobriand Islands.
For 3 years, Kate visited the horse races, living with the racing tribe. She has faced many of the same problems that Malinowski confronted when he arrived in the Trobriand Islands.
I think everything about this tribe confused me at the beginning. You know, you walk in here through the gates, you don't know what's going on. Everyone is apparently milling about, you know, in no particular, with no structure, no form to it, and you have no idea what's going on.
But certain rules gradually became clear.
The sort of tribal greeting introduction ritual, actually that you find out very quickly. You know, if you go to the races, you'll find it out your first time at the races. I did. The rule is, essentially, the unwritten rule, is that anyone can basically go up to anyone and say, what do you fancy in the next? It's a kind of standard. It's a bit like the English say, oh, nice day, isn't it? Or make some comment on the weather. We all know that that's a conversation starter. It's not a sort of request for meteorological data. And when you say to someone at the races, what do you fancy in the 2:30, you're not really asking about the horses in that particular race. You're saying, I'd like to talk to you, will you talk to me? And the response is almost invariably yes.
The more she stayed and watched, the more secrets she discovered. At first, there seemed to be a formal tribal hierarchy. Stewards and officials were the tribal chiefs and elders. They set the rules. Horse trainers, credited with performing miracles if a horse won, were the revered shamans and witch doctors. But she noticed that at the bottom of the pile, the tribal structure didn't quite match what she'd heard from the natives.
People would tell me that jockeys, you know, are a lower rank of citizen because, you know, they touch their caps. When they come in, you'll notice when they come into the parade ring, they touch the cap to the owner and the trainer.
But as Kate was watching the small men in their bright silks, a different picture started to emerge.
You see, I'd been told that jockeys were, you know, kind of servants, you know, that they were the lowest rung of the sort of owner-trainer-jockey hierarchy. But actually, when you watch them come in, you know, they look well aware of their exalted status, you know, and they're sort of twirling their whips and doing this kind of fanfare announcing their arrival. The owners and trainers immediately, all their attention is focused on the jockey. If you look at people's feet, all the feet are always pointing towards the jockey. Feet are the most honest part of our body because we're not aware of what we're signalling. And the owners are kind of leaning down to catch the sort of pearls of wisdom. And actually the jockey is mostly sort of uttering, you know, non-threatening diplomatic platitudes. But you know, his audience is riveted.
Participant observation revealed jockeys were respected and admired, despite the formal racing hierarchy.
In this tribe, they are, if you like, the equivalent of the young warriors, the young braves, a very special elite group.
Although they hold no formal political power, their talents have a higher value than wealth or official authority. 80 years since Malinowski invented participant observation, it still has the power to reveal fresh insights into human culture.
I mean, this is essentially, I think, why Malinowski is right. And you do have to spend a lot of time, because it's not until you've kind of hung out and wandered around, you know, for quite a lot of time before you realise, you start to see the patterns in what's happening in the behaviour. And that there isn't a particular technique for doing that, it's just hanging out. I think someone's called it anthropology or participant observation deep hanging out. And I quite like that term, because that's exactly what it is. You're hanging out, but it's a bit more than that.
Participant observation is Malinowski's greatest legacy to anthropology.
You see, I relied not only on what these savages said they did, but on observing exactly what they did. And there lies the essence of my work.
Malinowski's work brought him the status and glory he'd craved for so desperately all his life. And earned him professorships in Britain and America. Bronislaw Malinowski died an establishment figure in 1942. Founder and hero of modern social anthropology. Then in 1967 came something that brought Malinowski's reputation into question. His personal diaries were published. The man who'd elevated our understanding of native cultures seemed to be every bit as prejudiced as the Victorian anthropology he'd so criticized.
Last night I looked in vain for the fellows from my boat, and again this morning. Nowhere to be seen. Suddenly I am driven into a state of white rage and hatred for bronze-colored skin.
Some believe these outbursts severely tarnish Malinowski's reputation.
When I first read the diaries, I was shocked by the attitude that Malinowski reveals. They contain a very damaging picture, I think, still, but particularly at the time, of Malinowski's personality.
On one occasion I made a joke, and one of the bloody niggers made a disapproving remark. How dare he? How dare he talk to me in such a manner? How dare he, a nigger, find something in me to disapprove of?
Why spend your whole life writing books and founding a discipline if you are not interested in the people you're meant to be studying?
Those who support Malinowski point out that it isn't only the natives that he insults.
Another way of looking at it, which is to say, Malinowski is angry at all sorts of people in this book, and very intemperate, about the Australian administrators, about his colleagues, about some of his friends. Everybody is attacked, and above all, about himself. Nobody is criticized more fully and openly and completely than himself. So Malinowski's use of intemperate language is universal.
But perhaps his diaries reveal a truth at the heart of all anthropology. For all his attempts at scientific objectivity, Malinowski was, like every one of us, a prisoner of his own time and culture, with all its prejudices. Malinowski would no doubt be gratified to know that he continues both to intrigue and outrage. But one thing of which he was certain was his great significance and contribution to posterity.
He really did believe that he was prophet of a whole new way of thinking about human beings. He sometimes called it the new humanism. He really did feel this was terribly important for humanity, for this new thing. And a lot of his students believed it too. And it was very exciting.
Because of my work, the study of anthropology, so often mistaken for mere hunting after curios, or a ramble through the savage shapes of barbarous custom, crude superstition, anthropology might become one of the most deeply philosophic, enlightening, and elevating disciplines of scientific research.